Oh yeah, I forgot. Live from Brussels and Dublin, it's ZN Live. We are very excited today. We actually have a regular guest who's been on the show before, Gary Finnegan. We've known Gary for over a decade. Gary is a healthcare communicator and journalist. He's won the EU Health Prize for journalists for 3 consecutive years. That's right, until they just couldn't continue because he was winning too much. But he's also been working on Vaccines Today, writing about vaccines. And that's really what we're going to focus on today. So we're very, very happy to have you on today. Your latest post is actually about AI, which of course everybody on the internet is talking about. So you asked ChatGPT about vaccines. So tell us, Gary, what did you find out about vaccine? Can we trust artificial intelligence?
Well, it'd be too boring to give you a one-word answer to that, so I'll give you a much longer one. Well, you remember back at the beginning of Vaccines Today, like we had a nightmare with what Google would throw up when people asked questions about safety or effectiveness, and YouTube was even worse. Like, you know, some of the stuff that was there was terrible. Some of those sites have been improved. You know, some of the social media platforms are getting a bit better. But the latest one, obviously, is, you know, what is AI doing? So we asked a couple of simple ones, one about safety and one about just do vaccines work? And to be honest, the answers from ChatGPT were good. I thought they were pretty impressive. They're reasonably comprehensive. They were positive, and they weren't too, they were clear while being nuanced. They didn't give on the one hand, on the other hand, you know, that sort of false balance thing that people can sometimes do. So those are really good. Then, because that was too easy, I asked it to explain why Europe is not hitting the target of vaccinating 75% of older people against flu. And it gave a really nice kind of undergraduate essay, like 6 bullet points and an explainer. I thought that was also very good. So I think, you know, it's not bad. And then just for the fun, I asked it to write a poem about vaccines, but that was just because I got bored with the other stuff.
Well, that's the thing about ChatGPT, is that you obviously have to continue asking questions until things get weird. Now, after you told us about this, I went to check on GPT-4, which is the new version of ChatGPT, which we have access to through our ChatGPT Plus account, and also the Bard, which is Google's answer to Bing, basically, or the new Bing with the AI. And I shared that with you. So what were your thoughts on what? So GPT-4 is basically a more sophisticated version of ChatGPT, but it's still not connected to the web, so it doesn't provide sources. And Bard is Google, and that's completely new. Just started actually in the UK and the US. I got it through a VPN. So what were your thoughts on the answer? And I think Bard had a particularly weird answer on one of the questions.
Yeah, Bard is a bit of a worry, and it should be a worry for Google too. So on ChatGPT versus GPT-4, they were pretty similar. Bing, you know, new Bing was also pretty solid, a bit shorter, and it shows its homework. You know, it tells you sources where they got their stuff. But Bard, especially on Are Vaccines Safe, said, I'm not able to help with that, as I'm only a language model, which if you came with a safety question is a pretty ambiguous and useless answer, I would say. So yeah, that was even worse than giving sort of a half-assed answer. They said, I can't tell you.
Yeah, it's strange, and I think that at least with Bing, the new Bing, I think giving the sources, I find that it's not there yet. There's still plenty of mistakes, but it's getting in the right direction. I've done a lot of playing with Bard as well, checking out different things. I have seen some pretty impressive hallucinations. So that's when Bard is making stuff up. So I was asking about myself, who is Philip Weiss from ZN. I apparently worked at IBM and Microsoft, which I didn't know. I've also started a hyperthinking institute, which is, I think it's a good idea, but I
That's half
haven't.
true, yeah.
And I had a whole list of guests who appeared at the institute. So I thought, like, why are you continuing? Because I kept pressing with more detailed questions, and instead of realizing that this was making, it's like a liar who kind of goes, doubles down on the lie. And at some point I said, none of this is true. And they were like, oh, I apologize. It's like, whoa, what is happening? So,
you got me.
Yeah, you got me. Whoops. I just made everything up. So I think that that's very interesting. But behind this, I think the power of the tool is incredibly interesting. And I actually shared examples of ChatGPT when I was at the conference for IPA for doctors on how they could use it to help them to create content. Lior, you're also using ChatGPT and GPT-4 a lot. So what are your thoughts on how it can help you and communicators?
Before we go into that, Phil, you need to tell us about when they were making stuff up about that we have a course and people need to pay for it, and you were saying no, it's a free course, and they kept insisting,
yes,
no, it's a paid course.
That was Bing, actually. That was Bing again, getting into an argument, which is there is a weird bit when you say, look, I don't think this is correct. It doesn't seem to be able to run a check saying, Bing was going like, yeah, and it was just not true.
We have a hyperthinking course, and it got over 100,000 students. It's very successful, but it's free. But and it was saying, no, this costs a lot, and Phil was saying, no, it's a free course. No, and it kept insisting that it's a paid course. It's a hilarious
strange
interaction.
So how are you using AI and ChatGPT in your content?
So I use it a lot for inspiration, and I'm reading a lot of comments that it's really depressing, and this is the future of content. I don't understand this. I use it more as an assistant, a free assistant for some research, and then of course you need to still optimize, and but I really like that interaction, and I find it is as good as the prompts you give it. So if you give it very specific prompts, if you give it very generic prompts, you're going to get very bland answers. But it's the same. If you give an intern a very generic request, you're not going to get a very useful. But if you give it the person, or chatty, as I like to call ChatGPT, chatty, a very specific request. And so usually I ask for something, and then I say, well, no, I need it a bit more like this. I need it in this language. I need it for this type of audience. And so, for example, if you have a long transcript of a video that you've done, and you say, can you turn this into 5 posts? And then I say, can you turn it into 5 posts towards this audience? Can you turn it? So, and I find it super helpful. There are no grammar mistakes. I do a lot of translations to French, for example, and it's much better than my French. So I'm really impressed, really happy with it. I checked it with native speakers, seems to be really good. They can do Italian. Oh, I booked my Italian holiday. They helped me with Italian. So I am very happy with it. That's not a very specific answer. But
no, but I think I know it's very true. And by the way, I think it's important for people who are using it to not exaggerate. I think it's going to be transformative, but I think it takes a bit of time to figure out how to use it and what to use it for. By the way, I just want to say hi to Eileen, Gaia, and Anna, who are watching us right now. And to come back to how the medical professionals, HCPs, can use it. I mean, when I was demoing this in front of doctors, I was mainly saying, look, it can save you time. It's not going to do the work for you, but you can say, hey, help me to think of 5 posts on why you should vaccinate your children. And you can choose your topics. It can pre-write them. You, of course, have to check them. So what do you think, Gary, what do you think the impact of this new technology is going to be around vaccine and in particular the vaccine conversation? We've seen a lot of projects trying to create bots. In fact, we've been involved in a few of those, but they were still very, it's early days. It was, I would say, pre-Chat GPT. So how quickly do you think it's going to have an impact on the conversation? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I also started looking into this, presuming it would be terrible, and I was prepared to write journalism will live forever, but I'm a lot less sure now. For healthcare professionals and for vaccine communication, so we were in a a WHO network called the Vaccine Safety Net, and
Yep.
they had a project a few years ago of trying to create a bot on their own page. So people would land and ask, are vaccines safe, or is there a vaccine for measles, or whatever. And it took a long time, and they fed lots and lots of information, and it wasn't great. It was like a frequently asked questions bot, and if you didn't hit their keyword in your question, you got nothing, and it could give you the wrong answers. This is a vast improvement on that, I think. So that's for the public. For health professionals, I mean, I asked it to give me the 5 most relevant or most interesting points from a huge WHO measles report, and it gave me some pretty solid summary of it, or you could use it to write the executive summary of a very long report. I think you'd still want to check it and edit it, but as a first draft, not bad at all, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is that you cannot trust it for the final output. I think it's very important at this stage that the editing hat is actually critical. And I think, both of you are actually writers in your own right, so you can check things. But I think for a doctor, it's kind of, look, you have to check the facts. You can't assume that the facts are always going to be correct. As I said, we've seen hallucinations, and I think there are some issues which I'm sure will improve. But I think being cautious about that is critical. The other thing we're seeing is that we're going to be able to implement AI tools on specific data sets. So imagine you take, all the research you've got on vaccines from a specific reputed journal over maybe, 50 years of articles, and you feed them into this AI, and so it only uses that data as source. Now, I think that's going to be really interesting, because you can kind of close off the data so that it is reliable, but it understands natural language. And I think that's what I'm waiting. And I get the feeling that it's going to come quite quickly. We could imagine all the vaccines today content fed into a chat GPT type things, where you then get all those answers. What do you think? Where do you see the impact being the greatest for the moment? And I know obviously none of us really know this, but is it with doctors? Is it with the public? Is it with multilingual, or is it just simplifying content? Do you have any thoughts on where you think it'll have the most impact?
It's a good one. I don't know. I guess, doctors could use it. The amount of information is vast and ever growing, new papers all the time, just to try and make sense of all the noise. In the end, for now at least, as you said, this is not a health professional. This is not medical advice. And even from a liability point of view, if you're using it as a decision aid or support, you are still the one making the call and the one who is accountable to the patient. So, it will definitely have a role, and it will keep getting better. But the rest of, the system is not quite ready for it. One other one that comes to mind maybe is in terms of safety monitoring. So people sometimes post things on social media which are effectively a report of side effects or symptoms. All medical products have potential side effects, vaccines included, usually rare, etc. But if you want to get the signal from the noise, it could be a pretty good way. There are pharmacovigilance forms. This is all very boring, but they're quite pro forma, and you have to use the right language. This translates normal language into that type of data. So that would give you earlier reports of any problems. And if you have that, I think it should increase confidence overall that the system is watching for anything that might go wrong.
Yeah, and I think, one thing, the broader category of monitoring could be very interesting. Because we've always had this thing, can you monitor sentiment on social media? And the answer was always not really, because essentially, the interpretation of what's a negative tweet and what's a negative comment was always a bit, very, very, I think, incorrect. Now, with the kind of qualitative advance we have today, it might be that actually those judgments become much more sharp. And when you dig in, you'll see, okay, these are really the problems. And also, by the way, for crisis monitoring, which might mean that for vaccines, you could start detecting anti-vax campaigns, which are organized. and you can start saying, hey, this is really deliberate and we need to pay attention to that. So I think that there could be something, and potentially WHO and other institutions could set that up.
Yeah, well, I just on kind of monitoring on sentiment. I think it was Malawi. I'm not 100%, but during the COVID rollout in Africa, they had a big bank of people in the community who were reporting common questions and concerns, and they laboriously built responses to these and got them available and so on for the people in the field. Hugely labor intensive. Equally in academics, I mean, people write master's thesis on content analysis of the sentiment on various platforms. All of that now becomes so much faster. The accuracy of it, we'll see, but it'll definitely just keep improving. So I mean, I take a lot of positives. I was probably more skeptical last week, but the more I play with it, the more more worried I should be for my job. But no, the more exciting it is about what's going to happen.
Well, I mean, on that point, I think the critical competence is actually judgment and editorial, because I think a lot of the labor-intensive work is starting to drop, and I think that's going to be the reality. So you don't need to write the 15 versions of the tweet, but going through them and checking that they make sense with what you're trying to do, etc. I think that's going to be critical. And as you said, I think this idea of creating giant automated FAQs, where if you see what are the biggest questions being asked in this country, and then an institution, an organization with a reputation can say, well, let me help you find the answers. So I think that could be incredibly powerful. Now, talking about social media in general, there are two questions around this. One is trust and where we are today. You also wrote something about trust in vaccine in a previous article on Vaccines Today. There's an Edelman Trust Barometer, which we mentioned a few times. And in fact, Lira was at the discussion about the report, I think, last week, where they said that WHO is more trusted now than before COVID, before the pandemic. Now, my question to you is, do you think that trust in vaccines is getting better? And I know it's a slightly different question, but with what's happening with Twitter, especially, are things getting worse on specific platforms like Twitter?
Well, on the trust getting better, I suppose the best thing to do is refer to the actual research. So the European Commission got the Vaccine Confidence Project and has been running surveys for a few years, every couple of years. So broadly, things are back to baseline. They're a little bit, it peaked. Trust actually went up during the pandemic, and people's perception of the importance of vaccines and so on, and now is more or less back down to where it was before the pandemic. Apparently a bit lower in younger people, if I recall correctly, compared to older. So we're back to where we were. Also, generally, I did a quick Google Trends on people searching for the term vaccines, and that also follows the same peak. So people have just moved on, I think, or at least we're back to where we were. But the situation is different. There are more people talking about vaccines than there were before the pandemic. Some of them are angrier than they were before, and they're networked with other groups who are anti-whatever they might be, anti-establishment in different ways. But there's also a lot of pro-vaccine voices now who've come and are way more interested in talking about it and are practiced. They've just had 2 years of a baptism of fire in the field. So Twitter-wise, I mean, I haven't personally noticed a massive change in what's happening in the last few months. There's still plenty of negativity, but there's a lot more people there contributing positively, I think. You see a few people disappearing off to Mastodon or other places. We briefly discussed this, but I think unless everyone else leaves, we don't want to abandon a place where we have 20,000 followers or whatever it might be. So I think people are, getting over it and just going to stick around where the community is.
Yeah, I think the conversation on Twitter is still there. I think it is, the trust is lower for sure, because Musk's communication is very confusing and people just don't know where he's going with this. But as you said, the community is still there. Conversations still happen. So I don't think that it makes sense to abandon it, but I think it makes sense to keep an eye on other things. And I just want to check with you, Leroy. So you heard more from Edelman on the trust barometer. Was there anything that came out of it that you thought was particularly interesting beyond what we had discussed before?
Yeah, so Richard Edelman, the owner, I guess, of the company, said that there were 3 reasons why companies came out as the most trusted institution. So business came out as the most trusted institution throughout the pandemic. Specifically, it says it's invented jobs that saved our lives and kept us in jobs during the pandemic. Secondly, it's taking inclusion and diversity serious, specifically after the things that happened in the States. And also, he mentioned that it was very important, according to the piece of research, that 1,000 companies got out of Russia when the war against Ukraine started, and that the companies that didn't also really suffered in terms of trust and trust measurements. So those are the 3 factors that he said had a main, or that according to their research had a big impact on the positive trust on business. And so they also said that if you don't take inclusion and diversity serious, if you don't respond to the things that are happening in the world, in wars, then that will definitely have a big negative impact on trust.
Yeah, I think the responsibility of businesses is becoming, more important, and industry, Gary, obviously we've worked with Vaccines Europe, with the vaccine industry. Their role becomes more and more important as we move forward. I think their responsibility to communicate, to engage, to explain is becoming critical.
Actually, that's something he specifically mentioned, that the Pfizers of the world, they saved us during the pandemic. So although, of course, there's a lot of talk about such companies and the perception, he specifically mentioned that those are companies that saved us and gained a lot of trust. So that was how they perceived it.
And I think sometimes we get confused by the media cycle, which focuses on 1 or 2 stories, but we forget that behind those stories there's the everyday perception that people thought, hey, I'm getting a vaccine, it's protecting me, it's saving my life, and it's thanks to companies that did it. Whatever you might think about vaccine tests and safety in general. Gary, just before we go to the recommendations, I want to ask you one thing. If you were to look back at your younger self, which is, of course, just a few years ago, someone who's starting their career today, what would be your advice if they were in journalism, comms, healthcare? Anything you would tell them, or your younger self?
Well, I suppose, my younger self was operating in a different environment, so I don't know. Probably, but to someone now, like, a lot of the tips are still the same. It's still network and, put yourself out there. I guess there's so much noise and everyone wants to be heard. Probably a good tip is to just to read more, just to add value to the conversation by engaging with it. Like, everyone can't be shouting and expect to be heard. We do have to pause, think, and engage. So slow down a bit is probably is my wise old man words to the 23-year-olds of today.
Love it. You read more, pause, think. I think you're absolutely right. Actually, as we get produce more content, write more things, I think actually being more discerning, trying to think about what you're going to think before you post, think before you engage. I think it's, to me, the message is you must engage. You need to learn to communicate, but you have to improve how you do it, which is, by the way, quite a challenge. And I think that's the new skill that we really need. Now there's still time for some recommendations. So Gary, what are your recommendations for our audience this week?
Okay, I've got 2, one online and one analog. So the online recommendation, I think, for vaccine communication for me is still the Project Halo Twitter account. They're a little bit less active than they were in the pandemic, but these are kind of a young group of researchers and scientists who found a really kind of engaging way of explaining things really, really well, complex scientific things, but in a truly engaging manner, and they really seem like human beings, which is a big plus. So that's my Twitter account of the week, if you like. And then old school, came across a book which is already a few years old called On Immunity by Eula Biss. And this one is an interesting one because a lot of vaccine books are by doctors and scientists, but she is an essay writer, nonfiction writer, and a very celebrated one. And it was about her own journey when she went to think about vaccinating her kid. And mainly it kind of shows an empathetic approach to why people might not vaccinate and the forces that influence those decisions and the context that those decisions are made in, which is probably a more useful thing than shouting "you're wrong" at people on the internet. So I think that's a good one. If you want to have a pause and a think, that's a good place to start.
Excellent. So I think, Leora, you're still on the topic of communication. So what is your recommendation of the week?
Yeah, yesterday I got a weekly newsletter from James Clear, which I always like. And in that newsletter, he said that he heard from someone, I agree with the idea, but I disagree with the tone. And he encouraged us to separate substance from style. And then I thought, yeah, you can encourage everyone to do that, but why not encourage people to communicate better so that they can get more of their ideas approved? And then today I came across on Instagram a very good video from The Future, which is an account we really like. Here it's shown in the chat, so you can watch it. And it gives us gives you tips on how to become a better communicator, because everyone suffers from time to time of having a brilliant idea or being in a meeting and not being able to get your ideas across. And it basically comes down to practice and also being self-critical. So what does The Future teach you? And I really encourage you to watch this. There's a video, it's only 3 minutes long. It basically encourages you to do the following. Tape yourself for a video of 5 minutes, and then watch that. First, listen to the video. Listen to your voice. How do you sound? What is it about your voice? Is it a right tone of voice? Is it how do you sound? Just first write down all the comments you have about your own voice. I know it's not easy to listen to your voice because it's different than it sounds in your head, but just be very neutral about it and write down all the comments you have. So first, only listen to the voice. Then turn off the sound and see how you come across. How do you move your face? What do you do with your hands? Is there anything non-functional about it? Of course, if you're Italian and you want to use your hands, absolutely fine. We're not asking you to change your personality, but is there anything there that doesn't seem to be very helpful to your presentation? And then write all of that down as well. Then take a transcript of your presentation. Are there any filler words? Are there any repetitions? Or is there anything you're saying? There are all these words. Everyone uses words that you don't maybe need to use. Maybe you say every 5 seconds. I remember I just said I did it again. When you're not trying to do it, you do it so often. When I first started working for ZN, I did a presentation for Phil, and I used a lot of uhs. And Phil said, yeah, that was quite a good presentation, but can you just never say again? And I'm like, how does that work? How can I just never say that again? And Phil said, that's a conscious decision. You could just decide not to do that again. And I thought about it, and I thought, this man is crazy. How can you just not decide to do that again? And he said, you just breathe, and instead of saying you just don't. And it's true. In fact, if you have a presentation, you can just decide not to use certain words, not to use certain filler words, and it will make your presentation stronger. And it was one of the best tips, and Phil's given me many very good tips over the last 10 years. But this is just going to make your presence stronger. So be aware of those words, of those repetitions that you don't need, and highlight all of those in this transcript. And so when you do all of those things, now I'm going to say every 5 seconds. But then you're going to be so much stronger in your presentation, and you will achieve your goals. These kind of things can get in the way of promotions. They can get in the way of you achieving your sales targets or your communication targets, reaching those objectives with policymakers, with journalists. So it is really important. Communication is everything, and we cannot accept the other party to just read through our messages, because presentation communication is everything. So watch that video and do it. It's fun, actually, and do it with your children as well. I'm quite happy that my children are now teaching presentation skills already in primary school, because it is quite key to every single thing that you do. So that's my recommendation.
It's very interesting. I was actually just watching it before. So very good advice. And I'm saying as well. So I'm sure I didn't follow my own advice.
I don't think I do it a lot, but
I don't think it was that dramatic. But I think that the key thing actually in your post on LinkedIn on the same subject is that when you have a great idea, you have to choose whether you want to get the idea across or whether you want to get credit for the idea. I think that's critical, especially when you're working with clients, because often the price of getting the idea across is to get other people to buy into it. I particularly like the IKEA effect, get other people to engage with the idea so they think it's going to work. I see Gaia, who is Italian, and says, I can't possibly speak without using my hands. It's okay. We're saying you can, you should. Look, we're using our hands. It's all great. My recommendation is actually an old book called The Power of Impossible Thinking. I really like it. It talks about how it's the kind of the 4-minute mile paradigm shift. So how you can think of certain things as being impossible until you see them being realized, and then it changes your entire perception of a specific industry problem. I think we're seeing this with AI and ChatGPT. We're seeing some entirely new paradigms being created in front of our very eyes. We don't know exactly where it's going to take us, but we have to be open to that. So our natural predisposition is to resist change and to try to fit everything into the mental models that we have, but we need to learn to break those from time to time or to just upgrade them. And I think that's the moment we're in now. So I think that's all we have time for. Gary, thank you very much for sharing, for all the great work you're doing on vaccines today, helping people to better understand what's happening and writing good quality things. And no, journalism is not about to die, especially editing and chief editing, which is what you're doing. So more of that. So thank you very much. We will see you online and we will see you again. Bye-bye. Have a great weekend.
thank you, Gary.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Gary.